Welcome back to Nutrition Connection, the show where science meets storytelling. I'm your host, Dr. Kristen Hicks-Roof, dietitian, researcher, and lifelong advocate of the role of nutrition, health, and wellness. Each episode, I sit down with dietitians and nutrition experts all across the food and healthcare landscape, leaders whose work touches nearly every aspect of our lives. So whether you're a student, a seasoned professional, or someone simply curious about food, nutrition, and health, this podcast is just for you. The views, thoughts, and comments on this podcast do not reflect those of my employer nor the employers of my guests. So I'm really excited to bring on a brand new connection of mine. We have Richard Erhart. He is the founder of Intake IQ and also the clinical supervisor at St. David's Healthcare. Welcome to the show, Richard.
Thank you, Kristen. I really appreciate you having me on. Really excited to kind of just get our name out there, and really excited to just kind of talk to you and just talk to the whole community.
Well, I know we interacted a little bit on LinkedIn, which really started this connection, and it was kind of talking about when I was in a research study and trying to really assess and understand 24-hour recalls and food frequency questionnaires. And so I'm excited to really dive into the software that you're developing, Intake IQ, for health professionals to really leverage AI, but also be clinically smarter and to be able to be more efficient with our roles. So I really want to dive into there. But let's start all the way back from the beginning. What inspired you, Richard, and made you want to become a nutrition professional in the first place?
For sure. This goes back to, I was always an athlete in early high school. So I was kind of always naturally just relatively healthy until about the senior year of high school. And then I kind of quit sports and kind of got we'll just say, pretty overweight. And so I was, researching a lot about health and nutrition and, exercise and all these things. I got really into that. My mom was a nurse. And so she was always saying like, hey, always go into the health field. You'll always have a job. It's stable, all these good things about it. And so I kind of melted those two together, found, a registered dietitian and, researched what that was. And I ended up just pursuing that path early in my career and, ended up getting into a dietetic internship. I moved to California from Washington, lived a healthy lifestyle. I lost weight. I saw the change that it made in me as a younger, kid. And so, I was able to, at first it just started really in the kind of the weight loss realm. And then obviously as you go to school and get more involved, it evolves, much more than that, into the clinical world. So that's how I got to where I am today. But yeah, that was kind of the roots of what made me go down this path initially.
I also think it's really interesting how you talked about you moved to California and you kind of started to develop healthier habits. I'm originally born from California, but I live in the Southwest region of the US. And when you go there versus, let's say you go to the South or the Northeast or even the Midwest, the lifestyles are so different and just like how people think and breathe. And that's a generalization, but it's really, I think your environment and your surroundings do come so much into play that I don't think we really give it enough of how that can impact personal health, right? And nutrition is just one piece of that. So let's talk about your journey. You wanted to become, or maybe you were just interested in sports nutrition. I think a lot of people in nutrition want to aspire to be sports dietitians or in the athletic performance side. What kind of pivoted you into clinical, and talk about your journey a little bit to where you are today?
Yeah. That was always an interest of me. I knew it was, the positions are much more rare typically. As fun as that would be, I think, you getting out of school, my internship ended up being heavily clinical. And one of the concentrations was critical care in my internship. For reference, I moved from San Diego to Houston for my internship. And so I did my internship with Sodexo, really got into the critical care side, and I'm really like a math brain, like I love finance and numbers and all these things. And so, like the critical care side is like really where I found that I thrive a lot. Custom TPN management, electrolytes, and that sort of thing. I got a little taste of that in my internship. And then I kind of knew that out of, I knew I was going to be starting in clinical with my first job, with a reference from that internship. And everyone kind of always said, that's where you get your basis in clinical, and then you can kind of go outwards from there, which I know not everyone does or needs to. But at least that's where I got my start. And then that kind of, my career trajectory just kind of went really just down the critical care path. I started in small ICUs at small hospitals where they really just needed coverage. So I got my bones early there. And then transferred to a bigger hospital where I got more ICU experience, different ICUs, neuro, CV, trauma. And then, eventually my manager is just like, hey, go get your CNSC, career development. I can, can start teaching people, because I enjoy teaching that. And so that's really where I ended up was, being kind of the campus TPN manager of a relatively large hospital of like all our new interns, all the newbies coming in, I was kind of their intro into custom TPN management there with the electrolytes and all that. So that was kind of the push for the CNSC. And then I was able to pass that in 2024. So.
Well, and it's so funny that you talked about how you've built kind of that passion and career direction, because oftentimes what you see is people going the opposite direction from TPN. I remember my TPN calculations in my graduate internship, and I was like, I want to go as far away from this as possible. This is not my jam here. So I always think that's so fascinating that as dietitians, we kind of are all wired differently in a way that we can find our niche in different areas. And I think you pointed out something that I also thought was really interesting. You talked about how your internship almost like opened your eyes a lot more to critical care nutrition, because I know a lot of students have asked me in the past, like, oh, do I have to go to, X internship or Y internship because they have whatever rotation? And my general feedback was kind of any internship is a great internship. And then obviously it would be great if you like know the sector you want to go in. But did you choose that internship in Houston because of the critical care, or did you just so happen to be placed there?
I was lucky to land a job as a diet tech for Sodexo, pre-internship. So I actually, wasn't even able to get in the first time around, despite me thinking I was pretty competitive. I only applied to a few select programs, and it was a lot more competitive than I thought I was at this, so, I ended up getting in the second time around, and I had a lot more choice because Sodexo is a large company. They have a lot of different sites. My family was moving to Texas around COVID times. And so, everything was a little weird. Everything was kind of online. It was hard to get into sites, if you were going to be picking your own sites and, having to reach out and try to get into sites. So the good thing about the Sodexo program is they have all those connections. There's no, arranging, there's no reaching out to people trying to get placed. Like, you're just placed there and you're good to go. It's all set up for you. So anyway, that's how we got to Houston. And I would moved out there for family reasons, but I definitely think, be flexible with your internship options. You might be surprised at what you find, like what you might like. There's going to be things that you think you would like and that you actually do not, and you for sure can rule that out as a career option. So, be open, be flexible. Everyone for the most part is very young. You don't really know necessarily what you don't know yet. So, just be humble, learn a lot, be willing to take on multiple settings and things like that. And, I think, it'll work out. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think, you had really great experience in your internship, which really gave you kind of that path and direction. So let's dive a little bit deeper than that. You are a clinical supervisor. You talked about how you got your CNSC and really love teaching and mentoring in the TPN space. Let's dive a little bit deeper into Intake IQ. You're the founder of Intake IQ. What is that? What made you see that gap and actually move forward with creating that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you work in clinical, I think every one of us has experienced like, man, so a lot of these doctors, or like, other providers, like they haven't gotten very much nutrition education. I think it's 20 hours. They might've increased it to 40 hours recently, in their entire time in med school. And outside of that, it's pretty much just who they have in their internship. And, as far as like, a ton of doctors and residents who are super familiar with Aspen guidelines and how to initiate complicated nutrition support, or sometimes, just certain things like that, bolus feeding J tubes, stuff where you come in over the weekend and you go, oh no, like I have to fix this. And it's not like they're doing it on purpose. They just literally aren't taught these things. It's just not touched on as much as they need to be. And so, after seeing that enough, after having providers and rounds ask me like, hey, what's this formula do again? Can we do this instead of that? Well, when would I use this one? When would I use Vital versus Pivot? Or can I do Glucerna if they're, on pressors? Or, like they start asking these questions and they genuinely want to know. I've done in-services with providers and things like that. And it's, I just started seeing the gap. I was like, it would be great if we had something that could teach not just new dietitians, but also providers, and then also have like bedside support. And as I started to get into AI and technology, I realized the capabilities and at least the potential of it. The danger with AI, and we can get more into that later, is that you don't want it making decisions for you completely necessarily. But, if you have a domain expert that can kind of constrain those abilities and rein it in a little bit to where it's can only operate in this, on this essentially guideline or this roadmap. And if you can kind of rein that in a little bit and make it a little bit more targeted versus just typing a clinical question in the chat GPT or Claude, you're going to get varied results. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. And so it's like, is there some way that we could target this in our niche and give this to other providers? And, we can talk for days about how, dietitians, especially inpatient, are so understaffed nowadays. And, you're expected to take larger and larger and larger patient loads on top of in-services and going to quality meetings and all these things. And so it's like, where's the balance there? And so that was the giant problem that I saw that's getting bigger by the day. And so I was like, well, maybe I can make something to fix that, or at least help. And so that's how that idea was born.
Well, and I liked how you talked about, since my research was on educating health professionals on the importance of nutrition for well over 10 years, you hit spot on where you said they want to know. They want to help. Yeah. They want the best for their patients, but they don't know how to initiate it, what that might look like, what different formulations they can or cannot use, because you're right, they don't have extensive nutrition education across health professions. That is not just physicians, although typically those are your order prescribers. So there's definitely a gap here, and I do like this. So if you were to give a snapshot of what intake IQ is for any clinician who's listening, what is it and how does it help them in their clinical practice?
For physicians and administrators, I always pitch it as this is up to date for clinical nutrition alongside with bedside support, or it's paired with bedside support. So I'm creating a comprehensive clinical library. It's expanding by the day. I'm having other providers where I'm not a specialty NICU dietitian or a PICU dietitian. That is a totally different language from adults. And I know that I'm not qualified to vet all that information. And so, I've brought on people, contributors, and hired some people to kind of take a look at some of the information and expand that side of it as well. So it is comprehensive. It's not just adults. And so, that's what it's turning into, is we have a giant clinical library, like I said, that's growing by the day. This is your static information, similar to UpToDate, where you can look up guidelines, current practices. It is framed a little bit more for practical use. And so that's where I see maybe the use case with new dietitians and dietetic internships is a lot of times you get general kind of case study questions, but you don't get to really dip your toes in, what is my internship going to be like until you're there? And this is real clinical, practical guidelines, work, and recommendations for how you would actually practice in the hospital. It gives you a lot of exposure to some of the medical information, the IV fluids, the different types of, intravenous lipids and what the difference is between them all. And so, I think it can really prepare not only new dietitians coming into their internship and their first job, but I think then the bedside support side, which is the AI chat that I was talking about really, it is not just ChatGPT pasted into the website. There's a very, very extensive prompt for just purely adults and pediatrics that I have set up. And then we're working on NICU as well and some of the outputs there. But this is for your provider. This is for your busy provider that needs, it's a Sunday night. The dietitians aren't on call. There's no dietitian in sight. You have to come up with an order. That is what that purpose is for. Now, it can also be a great function for a case study or something like that. And I actually have two different modes on the chat output. So you can do brief for the busy providers who just need an answer to something, or at least help with a decision. And then there's a detailed, which is like, hey, I'm in school, I'm learning, tell me where those sources come from. Is that Aspen? Is that from somewhere else, et cetera. But the whole point of the chat is it's built by domain experts, and it's harnessed by current clinical guidelines and research. And so that way you're not getting some of those crazy outputs that you would if you just were to type it into ChatGPT or Claude. And so I think that's where the future of AI tools is going, is that, it's not meant to replace us. It's meant to help us make decisions and learn. And so, how do we do that in a safe, but also still adopt technology and be willing to modernize care, but at the same time still be safe and make safe clinical decisions. So trying to meet that gap.
One, AI, I mean, it's so fascinating. If you've missed my episode with Raul, I mean, he was so intriguing how he's talking about, the different use cases of these technologies. Mm-hmm. And I think you're spot on in that it sounds like Intake IQ is really this like real-time support system rather than going back to your encyclopedia or your textbook and looking up different formulations. It's kind of like, this is our nutrition up to date of practical guidelines. So excited to see you take that adventure. So talk to me, what does your day-to-day look like? Because you're still a clinical supervisor at a hospital. And so how do you balance both, and what does your day-to-day look like as you're taking off on this new adventure?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I do want to mention we do have a lot of calculators as well. So, for dietitians that are already knowledgeable, they don't need the recommendations. They just need quick outputs. We got tons of tube feeding, Clinomix, IV fluid calculators, GIR, stuff like that. So that all comes with it. But my day-to-day is busy. Monday through Friday, clinical supervisor. I'm ordering. Because of staffing issues, I actually put away our supplements and our formularies and stuff too. So, receiving in that as well. So, typically 8 to 4, 8 to 4:30, 8 to 5 that's what I'm doing. And then I kind of build Intake IQ around there. So, weekends, after work, I have a young son. He's almost 2 years old. And so, most of the time I like to just go home, with my wife and son and just kind of hang out with them as much as possible. So, but, early mornings, weekends, when I have time alone, that's when I'm kind of building Intake IQ. So.
Yeah, and it's kind of like a passion project. That's kind of where this podcast lies too. I have 3 little kids, and it's a lot. You really want to make sure that you have that dedicated time towards your family. Plus you're working full time. Plus you have this endeavor that you really think that there's a value add there for clinicians or students or whoever it might be. So I think that's a point to people. Here's 2 case examples that you can do it. You just have to learn that work-life balance for yourself, and everyone's looks different. I'm kind of like you, Richard. Like, I'm up super early in the morning. I try and get a few things done. And sometimes at night, before going to bed, where most people maybe are watching TV or whatever, I'm hanging out with my spouse, and I'm also, maybe designing Canva graphics on my phone at the same time. So you kind of get like this multi-purpose opportunity when you are balancing almost 2 careers in a way, but one is emerging. So you really talked about this tool as like an up-to-date, and obviously as a TPN and a clinical supervisor, I think it's inherent that research really plays a critical role in everything that you do, right? Clinical practice guidelines. So I would love to hear your thoughts. Like, how do you think research really is involved in your day-to-day role?
I mean, I think that's the engine that kind of drives everything. And like I said, there's a big difference between just typing something in the chat GPT and then knowing like where are those outputs coming from. It could be pulling half the information from a random study somewhere from 1997, and it could be pulling the other stuff from the Aspen guidelines. Like, you don't know unless you ask. So, that's really what drives it, is like, okay, how do we, everything that I'm building has to be, and everything that I'm doing also in my daily practice, like we're kind of redoing a lot of our TPN policies here that are a little bit outdated. And so how do we build that all from the most recent Aspen guidelines? This providers trust, these kind of organizations for their practice. And so they need to know that, whether it's the outputs from an AI chat or whether, what is their nutrition department doing, if administration's concerned about policies, and that sort of thing, like where are these policies coming from? So everything has to be research and, credible organization based. So without that, nothing really goes forward because you can't trust it. So.
Well, and it's so interesting. Like, I've really gotten down this rabbit hole as I'm learning more about large language models and AI, is how they're pulling information doesn't necessarily come from the most credible sourcing, right? Like, you would think Aspen guidelines would be the primary driver if you're thinking about enteral nutrition formulas. However, it could be, Sally Blue's blog and LinkedIn posts and all these other things where you're like, wait a minute, is that really the most appropriate? But it's something that I think we need to continue to understand. And as health professionals and clinicians, like, how are we making sure that our content and the content of not only the literature, but also practice guidelines are fueling the responses rather than random information from people who maybe don't have those skills, knowledge, or credentials behind it. So it's really interesting. And that's why you have tools like Intake IQ or like UpToDate, where you build this trustworthy machine and engine built on credible science and credible recommendations. So that way they don't need to go and find all the original sourcing. So I think that's something to be proud of, but it's also something that is needed in our field, especially as science is ever changing and recommendations change, right? Like all the time, why you have to keep on top of different clinical needs or recommendations. So what's been your favorite so far? I mean, you've kind of grown the ladder in the clinical setting, and now you're jumping off on your own endeavor, but what's been your most favorite or something you're most proud of in your career so far?
I think in one of the things that got me thinking, in more of the business side of nutrition is, it started with malnutrition at my old hospital. We launched a new initiative. We were able to increase compliance with diagnosis like up to 95%. So the MDs were matching our diagnosis, and also the number, increased massively of actually like identifying malnutrition, getting it diagnosed in the MD note, and then actually getting that coded for reimbursement. So that was a huge thing that kind of opened my eyes to, because, we're, as RDs, we're always talking about compensation and how can we, be more involved in the health team, and how can we get, seen by administration and, all these things. Right. And so, that was one area where I was like, well, this would be a great opportunity to, malnutrition is that area, and so, not only building that into a tool, but it's like just, every day into our hospitals in a management setting, like that, speak the language of, like other units and things. Cause this is the language that's going to be spoken in, your quality meetings and things like that. So, that's how you really kind of get integrated in that system. And I think that's, really important for us, as a profession. I think that's probably one of the most important things that I've done is play a role in that. And I think that prepared me, that manager and specifically prepared me pretty well for my role now. Just really kind of pouring into me a bunch of knowledge, that as clinical RDs, you don't always see the management side. And so, it's really important for our managers, clinical managers, to really represent our field and, really treat the RDs below them well and, prepare them for what's to come. So.
When I think what you talked about, how you could actually show the return on investment or the ROI as a clinical dietitian, especially with malnutrition, like that's something that I've been trying to push our profession as well is no matter what field you're in, if you're in research and education and clinical and private practice and media, how do you add a return to the greater industry, right? So like
Yeah.
if you're in a hospital setting, in order for us to have more respect and more inclusion on healthcare teams, we have to show the value add towards the patient. That may be reduced length of stay, improved clinical
Yeah.
outcomes, more billing and coding opportunities, right? And so
Hmm.
until we show those types of like measurable dollar associated outcomes, I don't think we're going to go that direction. I know I presented a webinar
No,
with Great
I
Valley
agree.
Publishing the other day on like the physician dietitian relationship and how
Hmm.
we really have to show value in your
Yeah.
individual setting. And then my dream job would be like, hey, Richard, like you're showing value at your hospital, publish that data, present it at
Hmm.
FNC, go to some of these conferences where now all of a sudden we can populate the literature of saying, wow, when dietitians were on a critical care unit, they reduced length of stay. They brought in, X number of dollars because of the malnutrition diagnosis, right? And that
Hmm.
all of a sudden now your little win turns into this bigger win that we as a profession can then use to be a data source as to why we're really good. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then, I mean, that's not even touching on the, getting ready for discharge, like good interventions versus bad interventions by us can totally, like you said, obviously delay their length of stay. But I mean, readmission data too. I mean, how many people go to inpatient rehab and then come right back because they're malnourished and weak and they just functionally can't do it, or home health, vice versa. So, I mean, I think that's all data that just hasn't been quantified yet. And I think if we can quantify that and show it to the decision makers, I think that not only promotes our field and gets us more involved in clinical care and which is all things people want, but it helps patients. I mean, we're not diagnosing patients that don't have like these are people who are malnourished. We just aren't getting credit or reimbursement or anything back from it. We're just treating and we're not getting anything for it. And so it's like, it can, like this is good for the profession. This is good for the patients. It's good for us, and it's good for the physicians. So, it just needs to be communicated, and I think it's starting to. I'm starting to see more content on it, and more education on it. But it really is kind of this. Still feels like almost like an emerging field. I've been in a bunch of different hospitals, and it's, it is totally variable. Where you go. And so I think it's this emerging field. That's one thing I focus on and kind of like pitch with Intake IQ is like, hey, help drive this malnutrition initiative in your hospital. And so, I think all these things can be extremely helpful. And like, of course, everybody wants a little bit more compensation. Like, if you can show that, hey, I saw a post on LinkedIn the other day, per dietitian, they were generating almost 150,000 of reimbursement, per dietitian, and if the dietitian's getting paid 50 or 60, like that doesn't really match up. So, if you're showing this value, then, you will be rewarded for it. And like you said, like, what is the value that we're bringing? Like, this is the value that's communicated.
When I think we know it as dietitians and
Yep.
nutrition professionals, we're like, I see patients, not being readmitted because I'm not going back to see them. I see patients
Mm-hmm.
happier and healthier and, improved strength and mobility, whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
But that's all what you see, right? Like we need to be
Yep.
documenting, charting, and then presenting that data in the masses to be able to,
Mm-hmm.
really move administrators and really move the profession overall. So I think there's a lot of
Yep.
room for improvement. I like how you said it's emerging, which is sad. We're in 2026 and it's emerging, but I think we've been doing
Yep.
it all along. And now we're finally
Mm-hmm.
collecting the data because we're like, oh, clearly we need to show value in terms of like a benefit
Yep.
beyond just we know they're doing a really good job. And I think that's for, I mean, if you've listened to any other episodes across the podcast, whether you're in the food industry or if you're in supplements or if you're in clinical
Mm-hmm.
or if you're in private practice, like we always are showing
Yep.
this. But why
Mm-hmm.
are we not learning it in school? Like, I think that's something that we also need to be thinking about. If you're an educator,
Yep.
like, we need to be integrating what ROI means and how we measure it across these different niche and sectors to really make sure that
Yeah.
as they become dietitians or whatever field they go into, they realize that they can not only provide the services and help the patients, which is our number one, but then they
Yep.
also are benefiting the bigger picture, because everything in the end of the
Mhm.
day is about money, right? And your
Yeah.
hospital is there
Absolutely.
to, process money and help patients in the meantime. But so
Yeah.
what tips or recommendations or advice would you give someone who maybe is interested in, clinical supervisor type role, and or maybe interested in like health technology and making that leap of faith to be able to really fill a gap in something that you may see in your facility?
Yeah. Um, Tips for, I mean, really for me, for leadership, it is, don't just wait for somebody to come to you or for you to, hopefully have that experience. Like constantly be seeking knowledge and wisdom. So, whether it's somebody you respect that you want to be like in your facility, whether that's outside of life too. I mean, I think that's in all things. Seek that wisdom from, and they can be leaders in other industries. They don't have to be leaders in as a dietitian, and they can be, and that's great. And I've had those, and then I've also just observed. Leadership is a lot of times just general qualities, and so and something that can be learned too. That's one thing too. Is I've seen so many people just kind of say, well, this is just kind of the way I am, and it's like you can learn a lot of these skills, and it may be uncomfortable, but you can. I mean, I was very much an introvert previously back when I was in high school, and I am definitely not so much anymore. So um like you can learn these things and you can learn these skills, and you can, if you admire it, then you can become that. You just need to learn from somebody and practice those things, and it just requires a lot of work. And so I would say always have open ears, always be listening, always be willing to just take on mentors. I think is probably the most important thing in whatever you want to do, and then do what you love, because that is really, I think, where you get that's where at least I get the fire behind everything that I'm doing. Is that's why I love Intake IQ. Is like I love the software space, I love business, I love numbers, I love all these things, and so like that's what's really gets me going. Is being able to take what I do as a supervisor and then apply that into a totally different area, and kind of get to see that come to life. And so that's, for me, that's like what does it for me. But you just have to find that for you. Like, what is that thing for you? I think you had mentioned it's research for you, and so it's, for everybody, it's going to be a little bit different. There's a lot of different personalities as dietitians. And so, lean on that, find something you love, and then just learn it.
What I think is such good advice too, of like, follow your passions, and your passions will guide you
Yeah.
to all the different career fields that we have in nutrition. Like, if you've
Yeah.
listened to any episodes on this podcast, you can see how diverse our fields are. And so I think that is something I remember when I was an academic, and I used to tell students, like, obviously try new things, right? That you maybe didn't know. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you moved to Houston and you went in a
Yeah.
clinical heavy internship, which you were maybe hesitant or unsure that that's the direction you wanted to go. So sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it's saying yes to things that are out of your thought process, that's your in your zone or in your bubble. I think it's some of
Yeah.
that, but then all of a sudden you're like, I'm putting all my passions into one, right? You
Yeah.
talked about how you love numbers and you love business, but you also love the clinical side. And it's like Intake
Mm-hmm.
IQ is this convergence of all of those. And it's really just your
Yeah.
passion. And now you found this gap to be able to fill the passion. So I think it's
Yeah.
really good advice there. And I loved how you also talked about mentors, because I don't think any person is successful in the career path that they are, and they couldn't name one mentor that, made a profound impact on them. So I think it's
Yeah.
an opportunity for us to continue to seek mentors, but also be
Mm-hmm.
mentors. So if you
Yeah.
are, middle career or later in your career, like making sure that you're devoting at least some time, it may not be a big chunk of time, but at least some time to really
Mm-hmm.
guide, support, inspire, and mentor that next generation who want to pursue especially niche and diverse career paths,
Yeah.
or starting your own, health technology. Like, that's not easy. You had to likely get mentorship and guidance to be able to go that direction.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's, it wasn't easy to start learning all that, but yeah, I mean, I think that's the other thing is just really be, I be open to different possibilities. And that's one thing that I always struggled with was like, okay, well, I guess my options are clinical or outpatient or food service. And it's like, no, there's dietitians, I email one for our shipping and receiving. It's like, there's a dietitian who does shipping and receiving for a company. There's sales reps, there's clinical liaisons, there's clinical informatics. If you like IT, there's endless possibilities, including starting your own business if you really wanted to do that, and it's not, like I said, it's not just private practice. There's a bunch of other gaps that need to be filled by somebody, and somebody will eventually. And so why not be you?
Yeah, no, I think you bring a lot of good advice. And, I'm kind of, when I was interested in starting this podcast, it was kind of like, I've been on a lot of podcasts before, but I didn't know what it was going to be like on here. So every day I'm learning. I mean, there's new things. I'm like, the other day I was on a podcast and someone had like a disclosure form, and I was like, that's really smart. I never thought about I need a disclosure form, And so I think you can learn as you go too, that you can, kind of absorb, you talked about having those open ears and just listening and being curious. And I do think that's a way that you can help to realize that there's gaps, and then do something that makes you uncomfortable, and especially if it's something you're passionate about. Okay, my favorite question, if you had a crystal ball, what do you think is coming next in nutrition, Richard?
I think technology is a big part of it. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing, is because I see that wave coming, and it's coming quick. And so, it's like, I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what that's going to be like. I mean, I think most of it is kind of, because it is so new, it's kind of limited to the EMRs and charting and the, it's starting there, but eventually it will make it out to our niche. And so, I think that's probably, like really modernizing the industry is going to be the wave that's coming next. And so that's why I kind of wanted to get ahead of it. And like again, why not you? So, try it. If you fail, it's okay. And just try to get ahead of it and see what that looks like. And, I think it's really important for the clinicians and not just for our domain, but really for any domain, whether it's respiratory therapy or physical therapy or you're an NP, really having a role in the development of those softwares. Like I think that we need to put clinician brains behind a lot of this technology. Otherwise, like I've seen a lot of LinkedIn, content about just like the safety of AI and like how do we need to. Everyone was excited and just started implementing all these things, and then they realized, oh wow, okay, this actually isn't as smart as we think it is. Like, this is not replacing us, obviously. Like, this is something we need to harness and control and have safety guidelines and build control with, and like I said, I think it can be effective in the right setting, but it's like, we need providers to build those guardrails, and we need us, like the brains behind it, the research, to still fuel all that.
When to me, I feel like the clinicians and the nutrition experts almost help to bridge this gap, right? So you have all this. AI is great about just content, and content is awesome, right? We know as educators, you can always teach something. You could teach anything you want to your patient, but you also need to bridge this gap of where is the patient or the community member or the clinician or whoever it might be. Where are they in their baseline knowledge, and then where are they able to learn or change behaviors? And so you really have to bridge this gap. And I think that the same goes for AI technologies. Like, yes, of course, you're going to have, the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry and the agriculture industry. Like every industry is going to adopt AI. And they've already begin adopting it. But how do we make sure that a nutrition expert sits at the crux of it, so that way they can translate it into real life guidance that would make sense for a patient, right? Because sometimes what gets spit out of AI like sounds good in theory, and then you're like, wait a minute, like that patient can't eat that food, or that doesn't make any sense for
Yeah.
that cultural diet, or whatever it is. And you're like, okay, this is a great idea, but I got to start back from ground zero because that is
Yeah.
not appropriate. And especially I feel like in the clinical space, when you are potentially life-saving in like an
Hmm.
ICU, where
Yeah.
you can't
It's really important.
necessarily really overdo certain vitamins or minerals, or you could actually,
Yeah.
contribute to a heart attack or something like that. I mean, that you can't really
Yeah.
rely on some of these technologies for something very
Yeah.
critical at this time.
Yeah. It's just, it's really early. Like you really still need clinicians to be behind this and be like, hey, well, that doesn't make sense. I mean, there's been several times where it's like, you push back on something like on ChatGPT and it's like, oh yeah, good point. You're right. And it's like, okay, well, that would have been bad if you just took its advice. And so, it's like, how can we best build something that is still useful, but it's modern, it's useful, but it's not, like we need to still be in charge of everything. So,
I love how you gave that example, Richard, because it was so funny. The other day I was ideating a concept of a speaking presentation. I'm like, give me some ideas of people who might be good co-presenters in this area. And a researcher got populated in there. And then I was like, wait, that researcher, like, they passed away. And so I looked it up because I wanted to confirm. And then I got back and I went to like Chat GPT and I was like, actually, that researcher is not able to do it. They had passed away. And it's like, oh, thanks for the feedback. And I'm like, wow, this is crazy.
yeah.
If I would have just taken it straight on, you know what I mean? Like, that is not real.
Yeah.
So Richard, thank you so much for the conversation. If you like the conversation, make sure you like, subscribe, leave a review. But most importantly, check out the next episode, because every episode I bring on a different dietitian or nutrition professional to share their story and give you tips and advice on how to be successful in that career.